I walked into that luxury hotel wearing borrowed jewelry and a dress I couldn't afford, determined to experience how the other half lives, just for one night. I never expected to meet someone who would see right through my facade, or that I'd fall for him anyway. I've never considered myself particularly adventurous. Most days I'm just trying to make rent on my tiny apartment while juggling student loans and a job that barely covers the bills. You know those people who post about living their best life in designer clothes at exclusive restaurants? Yeah, that's definitely not me. I'm more like the girl who gets excited about finding a good deal at the thrift store or when my favorite ramen place offers a two-for-one special. But there's always been this part of me that wonders what it would be like to live without constantly checking my bank account before making a purchase. To walk into a store and buy something just because I want it, not because it's on clearance. To know what it feels like to belong in those spaces where money isn't just something you have, it's something you flaunt. I guess that's why when my friend Jamie mentioned she could get me into this super exclusive charity gala at the Westbrook Hotel, something inside me sparked. Not just to attend, but to actually pretend I belong there. To slip into that world completely, even if just for one night. Was it dishonest? Absolutely. Was it ridiculous? Probably. But the idea grabbed hold of me and wouldn't let go. What's the worst that could happen? I remember thinking, as if tempting fate itself. I'll have a fancy night out, drink champagne I could never afford, and go back to my normal life with a good story to tell. That's what I told myself anyway. A harmless experiment, a chance to try on a different life, like trying on an expensive dress, knowing full well I'd have to take it off at the end of the night. I never expected that my little masquerade would lead me to him. I never thought that being caught in my lie would be the best thing that ever happened to me. And I certainly never imagined that pretending to be someone else would finally lead me to myself. So here's my story. Not some polished, perfect romance where everything works out because the universe conspires to make it happen. This is messy and real and started with a complete lie, but sometimes the wrong beginning leads you to exactly the right place. Stay with me as I share how one night of pretending changed my entire perspective on what really matters in life. How I walked into that hotel as a fake version of myself and walked out having met someone who would teach me the value of being real. Because the truth is, we're all pretending in some way or another. The trick is finding someone who sees through it all and chooses to stay anyway. Looking back, I'm almost embarrassed by how much effort I put into this charade. But at the time, it felt like preparing for the most important role of my life. My first stroke of luck came from my friend Lily, who works as a stylist for a fashion magazine. When I told her about my social experiment, she didn't judge. She just laughed and opened her closet of samples. This one, she said, pulling out a midnight blue dress that probably cost more than 3 months of my rent. It's from last season's collection, but no one at that gala will know the difference. The fabric felt like water between my fingers, so delicate I was afraid I'd tear it just by breathing too hard. The jewelry came next. A borrowed set of sapphire earrings and a tennis bracelet that made my wrist feel unnaturally heavy. Just don't lose these, or we're both dead, Lily warned, only half joking. I promised to guard them with my life, already feeling the weight of my deception growing heavier than the jewels. For 3 nights straight, I stayed up watching YouTube videos of wealthy women being interviewed, studying their mannerisms, how they held their glasses, the casual way they referenced their second homes or recent trips to Milan. I practiced in front of my bathroom mirror, training myself not to widen my eyes when discussing large sums of money, rehearsing anecdotes about fictional business successes. I run a boutique digital marketing agency. I decided would be my cover story. Vague enough that I could pivot if questioned too deeply, but impressive enough to explain my supposed wealth. I memorized industry jargon and recent marketing trends, created a mental roster of fictional high-profile clients. The night before the gala, I barely slept. I kept picturing myself being exposed as a fraud, pointed at and laughed out of the venue. But underneath that anxiety was an undeniable current of excitement. For one night, I would step out of my struggling, paycheck-to-paycheck existence and into a world where possibilities seemed limitless. The day of the gala arrived with rain, because of course it did, and I spent an hour under my apartment's temperamental hairdryer willing my newly styled locks to cooperate. My hands trembled as I applied makeup, following a tutorial specifically for evening elegance. Each stroke of concealer, each sweep of eyeshadow felt like another brick in the wall of my facade. "You can do this," I whispered to my reflection, a stranger looking back at me in borrowed finery. "Just one night, just a few hours." As I stepped into the Uber I'd splurged on, no arriving by subway in this outfit, clutching a tiny purse that held only my phone, ID, and lipstick, I felt like I was leaving more than just my apartment behind. For tonight, I was leaving behind the constraints of my actual life. The stack of bills on my kitchen counter, the ramen noodles in my cabinet, the constant calculations of what I could and couldn't afford. What I didn't realize then was that I was also leaving behind something else. The safety of being exactly who I was, flaws and all. When you're yourself, no one can expose you. When you're pretending, the fear of discovery never quite leaves your side. And as my Uber pulled up to the glittering entrance of the Westbrook Hotel, that fear was right there with me, whispering over my shoulder that I didn't belong. The moment I stepped into the grand ballroom of the Westbrook Hotel, I felt like Dorothy entering the Emerald City. Everything glittered. The chandeliers, the jewelry, the polished marble floors that reflected it all back in a dizzying display. The air itself seemed expensive, perfumed with designer fragrances and privilege. My heart hammered against my ribs so violently I was sure everyone could see it through the delicate fabric of my borrowed dress. "Champagne, miss?" A waiter appeared beside me, offering a tray of flutes filled with golden bubbles. I took one, careful to hold it the way I'd practiced, lightly between my fingertips, as if it were an extension of my hand, rather than something I was desperately trying not to spill on my borrowed finery. "Thank you," I said, trying to sound bored, like this was just another Tuesday night for me. I took a small sip and wandered deeper into the crowd, mimicking the confident posture of a woman across the room who seemed to command attention without even trying. The first hour was a dance of avoidance. I lingered at the edges of conversations, smiling knowingly at jokes I didn't understand about tax havens and summer homes. I nodded appreciatively at discussions of artists I'd never heard of and restaurants with month-long waiting lists. When asked directly about myself, I delivered my practiced lines about my boutique agency with what I hoped was casual confidence. "Digital marketing is just so essential these days," commented an older woman dripping in diamonds. "My son has been telling me I need to understand crypto for my portfolio. Do you deal with that sort of thing?" A flash of panic. I hadn't prepared for this tangent. "I focus more on brand narrative and audience engagement," I replied, pulling terms from articles I'd skimmed. "Crypto is fascinating, but it's a specialized field of its own." She seemed satisfied, and I excused myself to say hello to an old friend I'd spotted across the room. A complete lie, but it got me out of the conversation before I could be exposed. As I moved away, I caught a glimpse of myself in one of the large mirrors lining the wall. For a startling moment, I didn't recognize the woman staring back at me, poised and polished in her expensive dress. Was this really what wealth looked like? Just better clothes and more confidence? The evening wore on, and with each successful interaction, my nervousness began to fade, replaced by a strange, almost intoxicating confidence. I was pulling it off. These people, with their old money and new toys, couldn't tell I didn't belong. There was something both thrilling and deflating about that realization. But as the novelty wore off, I began to notice other things. How many conversations revolved around possessions rather than passions? How often people checked over each other's shoulders while talking, scanning the room for someone more important to speak with. The competitive undertones when discussing children's achievements or recent acquisitions. "Did you hear about Thomas's new yacht?" One man whispered loudly enough for the entire group to hear. 42 meters. Custom everything. Makes his last one look like a rowboat." Everyone laughed, but there was something hollow in the sound. Standing there sipping my third glass of champagne, I felt a peculiar emptiness settling over me. I'd wanted to experience how the other half lived, but now that I was here pretending to be one of them, all I felt was exhaustion. The constant performance, the measuring, and being measured, it was exhausting. And I'd only been doing it for a few hours. What would it be like to live this way permanently? As I contemplated making an early exit, retreating back to my simple but honest life, a deep voice behind me said, "These events are always so tedious, aren't they? Everyone working so hard to impress everyone else." I turned around, and that's when I saw him for the first time. Tall, with kind eyes that seemed to see right through the room's pretensions. And though I didn't know it yet, right through mine as well. His name was Ethan, and he looked exactly like the kind of man who belonged in these rooms. Tailored suit that fit him perfectly, an expensive watch that caught the light when he gestured, and that indefinable air of someone who's never had to check a price tag. But there was something different about his eyes, a warmth, a hint of amusement, as if he was both part of this world and slightly apart from it. "I'm guessing you're not enjoying yourself either," he said, leaning against the bar beside me. Not a question, but an observation delivered with a half smile that made my stomach flip in a way that had nothing to do with anxiety. "What makes you say that?" I asked, immediately on guard. Had he somehow seen through me already? Was my carefully constructed facade that transparent? "You've been watching everyone like you're taking mental notes," he replied, signaling the bartender. "Manhattan, please, and whatever the lady would like." "I'll have the same," I said, though I'd never ordered a Manhattan in my life. I'd been sticking to champagne because it seemed safe, expected. And I wasn't taking notes, just observing. Observing what? His eyes held mine, genuinely curious, not just making conversation until someone more interesting came along. I hesitated, then decided on a half-truth. How people perform wealth. It's fascinating, don't you think? All these subtle signals we send about belonging. His eyebrows raised slightly. That's surprisingly insightful for one of these events. Usually the conversation revolves around who's bought what island recently. The bartender slid our drinks across the polished wood. Ethan raised his glass in a small toast. "To honest observations, then." I clinked my glass against his, something warm unfurling in my chest that wasn't just the alcohol. To honest observations. The Manhattan was stronger than I expected, but I sipped it like I knew what I was doing. We talked about the charity the gala was supposedly supporting, though he noted wryly that more money had probably gone into the floral arrangements than would actually reach the cause. About the city, about books we'd read recently. With every topic, I waited for the moment I'd slip up, say something that revealed I didn't belong in his world. "So tell me about your agency," he said eventually, and my heart sank. Back to the performance. "It's small but growing," I recited my prepared line. "We focus on helping clients find authentic ways to connect with their audiences in an oversaturated digital landscape." "Interesting," he nodded. "Which clients are you most proud of working with?" I rattled off a few names I'd researched, mid-sized companies that seemed plausible. He listened, head tilted slightly. "That's impressive work on the Jenkins campaign," he commented, "especially considering they've been exclusively using Horizon Media for the past decade." My blood ran cold. I'd been caught in my own web of lies. I, I meant to say we pitched them. The partnership is still in development stages." He smiled, but it wasn't cruel or mocking. "Would you like to get some air? The terrace has a great view of the city, and it's usually quieter." I should have made an excuse. I should have realized this was the moment to gracefully exit before my deception unraveled completely. Instead, I nodded and followed him through the crowd, past the glittering people with their glittering lives, out onto a terrace where the cool night air hit my flushed face like a reprieve. The city stretched before us, a galaxy of lights against the darkness. Up here, away from the performance inside, I could breathe again. We stood side by side at the railing, looking out at the view that people paid millions to wake up to every morning. "Beautiful, isn't it?" he said softly. "Yes," I agreed, meaning it. For a moment, we were just two people appreciating the same sight, no pretenses between us. Then he turned to face me, his expression gentle but knowing. "So," he said, "do you want to tell me who you really are?" The words hung in the night air between us, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. My carefully constructed world of make-believe crumbled around me like a sandcastle hit by a wave. I considered lying again, doubling down on my fabricated identity. But something in his eyes, not judgment, but genuine curiosity made me stop. How did you know? I finally managed, my voice smaller than I intended. Ethan leaned against the railing, his smile kind rather than triumphant. Little things. You hold your champagne glass a bit too carefully, like you're afraid of breaking it. You looked at the menu prices earlier when you thought no one was watching. The designer of your dress went out of business last year, so that's definitely a borrowed piece. But mostly, he paused. It's the way you observe everything. People who've always had access to these spaces don't really see them anymore. Heat rushed to my face and I turned away, looking out at the city lights to hide my embarrassment. So you've been watching me all night, just waiting to call me out? Is this the part where security escorts me out? Not at all, he said, so genuinely that I had to look back at him. I've been watching you because you're the most interesting person here. Everyone else is playing the same tired game they always play. You're different. I laughed, a short, bitter sound. Different because I'm a fraud. Different because you're authentic, even in your inauthenticity. He turned to face the view again, giving me space. I'm guessing there's a story here. The weight of my deception suddenly felt too heavy to carry. Maybe it was the champagne, or the Manhattans, or just the relief of being seen, really seen, after a night of hiding. But the truth came tumbling out. I told him about my real life, the struggling freelance writer barely making ends meet, the curiosity about how the other half lived, the borrowed dress and jewelry, my friend's invitation that had made this night possible. It was stupid, I concluded, and dishonest. I just wanted to know what it felt like, just for one night, to not worry about money, to belong in places like this. Ethan was quiet for a long moment after I finished, and I braced myself for his disgust or amusement. Finally, he spoke. Can I tell you something I've never told anyone at one of these events? His voice was low, almost a confession. I hate them. All of this, he gestured toward the glittering ballroom behind us, feels like an elaborate play where everyone knows their lines, but forgot why they're performing in the first place. He ran a hand through his hair, suddenly looking less polished, more human. I was born into this world, never had to pretend like you did tonight. But sometimes I feel like I'm the one who's faking it, nodding along to conversations about stock portfolios and vacation properties, when all I really want to talk about is books or ideas or anything real. I studied his face, trying to determine if this was pity or some elaborate game. Why are you telling me this? Because you had the courage to step into a world you didn't belong to, while I've never had the courage to step out of the one I was born into. His eyes met mine. And because when you were pretending to be someone else, I got the sense that you were actually being more yourself than most of the people in that room who aren't pretending at all. Something shifted between us then, a barrier dissolving, replaced by a strange, unexpected connection. Here we were, two people who didn't quite fit, finding each other in the space between authenticity and performance. So you're not going to report me to the charity gala police? I asked, attempting humor to mask how vulnerable I suddenly felt. He laughed, a genuine sound that made me smile despite myself. Your secret's safe with me. Though I am curious, now that you've spent a few hours in this world, what do you think of it? I looked through the glass doors at the glittering crowd inside, then back at him, this man who had every reason to judge me, but was instead treating me like someone worth knowing. I think, I said slowly, finding the truth as I spoke it, that I came here looking for something, but it wasn't what I thought it was. And what was that? He asked softly. I'm still figuring it out, I admitted, but I'm starting to think the view's better out here on the terrace than it ever was inside. We stayed on that terrace for what felt like hours, the party continuing without us behind the glass doors. As the night air grew cooler, Ethan offered me his jacket, a gesture so simple yet somehow more genuine than any interaction I'd had all evening inside. So what do you really do? He asked, genuinely interested in a way no one at the gala had been. When you're not infiltrating high society events? I laughed, feeling the freedom of no longer needing to pretend. I'm a writer, or trying to be, anyway. I do content writing for websites to pay the bills, but what I really love is creative nonfiction, personal essays, that sort of thing. "Have you been published?" The way he asked made it clear that it wouldn't matter either way to him. "A few small literary magazines, nothing that pays, but it keeps me going." I hesitated, then added, "Actually, this whole night might make a pretty good essay someday, complete with the part where you get caught." His eyes crinkled with amusement. "Especially that part," I smiled, "though I might change some names to protect the innocent." "Am I innocent in this scenario?" he asked, leaning slightly closer. "That remains to be seen," I replied, surprising myself with the flirtation in my voice. We talked about everything after that, real conversations that had nothing to do with status or appearances. He told me about growing up with expectations weighing on him like gravity, about studying architecture because he loved the idea of creating spaces where people could feel at home, about the nonprofit he was quietly funding that helped provide affordable housing solutions. "My family thinks it's a phase," he admitted. "They're waiting for me to get serious and join the family investment firm. They don't understand that this is what I'm serious about." I told him about my small apartment with a bookshelf that took up an entire wall, about the writing workshop I attended every Wednesday night, about the novel I'd been working on for 3 years that lived in fragments on my laptop. As we talked, the gap between our worlds seemed to narrow, not because I was pretending to belong in his, but because we were creating a new space altogether, one where neither of us had to perform. "It's strange," I said, watching the city lights flicker below us. "I came here tonight to experience what it would be like to be someone else, but I've never felt more like myself than right now talking to you." "Maybe that's because you're finally being seen for who you are," he suggested quietly, "not for what you're wearing or what you own or what connections you have." Our eyes met, and something electric passed between us. Recognition, possibility, a shared understanding that whatever was happening here was rare. "I should probably go," I said reluctantly, aware that my borrowed finery needed to be returned by morning. "My Cinderella night has a strict deadline." "Can I see you again?" he asked, direct and sincere in a way that made my heart skip. "The real you, no pretenses." I hesitated. "You realize I don't actually belong in your world, right? Tonight was a one-time masquerade." "I'm not asking to see you in my world," he said, taking my hand gently. "I'm asking if I can see you in yours, or somewhere in between, somewhere real." He took out his phone, and I gave him my actual number. Not a business card with a made-up company, not a vague promise to connect on social media, but my real contact information. It felt like handing over a piece of myself, vulnerable and honest. "I'd like to take you to dinner," he said. "Nothing fancy, just good food and more conversations like this one." "I'd like that," I admitted, feeling both terrified and exhilarated by the possibility. As we walked back through the ballroom toward the exit, the glittering crowd seemed different somehow, less intimidating, less impressive. I realized with sudden clarity that I no longer envied them. Whatever I had found tonight on that terrace with Ethan felt more valuable than anything inside this room. At the door, he hailed a cab for me, his hand lingering on mine as he helped me in. "I'll call you tomorrow," he promised. As the taxi pulled away, I looked back to see him standing there, watching me go. A man between two worlds, just like me. True to his word, Ethan called the very next day. Not a text, but an actual phone call. Something so rare in today's world that I almost didn't answer, thinking it must be a spam caller. His voice on the other end of the line made my stomach flutter in a way I hadn't felt in years. "I was thinking we could get dinner tonight," he said. "There's this little Italian place in my neighborhood. Nothing fancy, just really good pasta made by an elderly couple who argue in Italian while they cook. No five-star restaurant, no exclusive club, just a neighborhood spot where the food mattered more than the scene." I agreed immediately. I spent an embarrassing amount of time that evening trying to figure out what to wear. Everything I owned suddenly seemed inadequate. Not because I was trying to impress him with wealth I didn't have, but because I wanted him to see the real me, and I wasn't even sure what that looked like anymore. I finally settled on my favorite jeans and a simple blue sweater that my friend once said brought out my eyes. No borrowed jewelry, no pretense. Just me. The restaurant was exactly as he described. Small, warm, with checkered tablecloths and wine in glasses that didn't match. The elderly owner greeted Ethan by name and showed us to a corner table, telling him something in rapid Italian that made him laugh. "What did he say?" I asked after they'd gone. "That his wife thinks you're much prettier than the last girl I brought here?" Ethan translated, his eyes twinkling. And I have to agree with her. In the soft glow of the candle between us, I felt a strange reversal from the night before. Here, in this simple place, Ethan was the one who fit in perfectly, who knew everyone's name and spoke their language. I was the outsider, but not in a way that made me feel less than. Just different, complimentary. Over plates of handmade pasta that put every expensive meal I'd ever had to shame, Ethan told me more about himself, how he'd used his family money to start a small architectural firm focused on sustainable urban housing, how he split his time between the world he was born into and the one he was trying to create. "My parents don't understand it," he admitted, twirling pasta on his fork. "They think I'm slumming it or going through some phase of rebellion. They don't get that I'm just trying to do something that matters." "And does it," I asked, "matter?" He looked at me thoughtfully. "I think so. I hope so. The buildings we design help people live better lives in the city without having to be wealthy. That feels more meaningful than anything else I could be doing with my time or my privilege." I told him about my own work, the freelance gigs that paid the bills, the personal essays I wrote late at night, the constant juggling of passion and practicality. "I'd love to read something you've written," he said, and unlike when people usually say that, he seemed to genuinely mean it. As weeks turned into months, we created our own world together, one that existed in the space between his life of privilege and my more modest reality. We found joy in simple pleasures, cooking dinner in my tiny kitchen, where he was amusingly inept but enthusiastically willing to learn, weekend hikes outside the city, afternoons spent in bookstores where we challenged each other to find the most interesting title. There were awkward moments too. The first time he saw my apartment, with its secondhand furniture and thin walls through which we could hear my neighbors arguing, I felt a flash of the same inadequacy I'd felt at the gala. But he looked around with genuine interest, immediately spotting my prized possession, a vintage typewriter I'd saved months to buy. "This is great," he said, running his fingers over the keys. "It has character, history." When I met some of his friends at a birthday gathering, I felt the same imposter syndrome creeping back, until I realized that Ethan was subtly guiding conversations toward topics I could engage with, making sure I was included without ever making it obvious he was doing so. We navigated our different financial realities with growing honesty. When he suggested weekend trips I couldn't afford, I learned to say so directly instead of making excuses. When I insisted on splitting checks, even though he could easily pay, he respected that it mattered to me to contribute equally, even if the amount was different for each of us. "It's not about the money," I explained one night, after we'd had our first real argument about him trying to pay for everything. "It's about feeling like I bring something valuable to this relationship." "You bring everything valuable," he said softly, taking my hand across the table. "The money is the least interesting thing about either of us." 6 months after that charity gala, as we sat on the same terrace where he'd first seen through my facade, now opened as a public space by day through one of his firm's initiatives, he asked me to move in with him. "Not to my current place," he clarified quickly. "Somewhere new, somewhere that would be ours from the beginning." I hesitated, all my old fears about not belonging in his world surfacing again. "I'm still the same person who couldn't afford to be at that gala," I reminded him. "That hasn't changed." "But I have," he said simply. "You've helped me see that the world I was born into isn't the only one worth living in. And I hope that I've helped you see that you belong wherever you choose to be, not where your bank account says you can be." Today marks 1 year since that night I walked into the Westbrook Hotel wearing a borrowed dress and a made-up life. 1 year since I met the man who saw through every layer of pretense to the person underneath and chose to stay anyway. Ethan and I live together now in an apartment that's neither extravagant nor cramped, a place we chose together, a perfect middle ground between our two worlds. My books share shelves with his architectural models. My thrift store finds mixed with his family heirlooms in a way that somehow makes both look better. We're not just coexisting, we're creating something new from the pieces of our separate lives. I still write my essays at night, But now they sometimes get interrupted by Ethan bringing me tea or reading passages over my shoulder and asking thoughtful questions that make the work better. My first collection of personal essays is being published next month, including one about a night of pretending that led to something real. Ethan's architectural firm is thriving, focused on projects that balance beauty with accessibility, creating spaces where people from different backgrounds can come together. We still navigate the complexities of our different financial realities. His family still occasionally makes comments that remind me of the gap between where I came from and where he did. My friends still sometimes look at him like he's a different species when he doesn't understand references to struggling paycheck to paycheck. But those moments come less frequently now, overshadowed by all the ways we've learned to bridge those gaps with honesty and humor. The truth is, I went to that gala looking for a glimpse into a world I thought was better than mine, more exciting, more fulfilling, more worthy of envy. What I found instead was that the trappings of wealth were just that, trappings. The real luxury in life isn't about what you can buy or where you can go. It's about being seen for exactly who you are and loved because of it, not in spite of it. I sometimes think about how many versions of myself I tried on that night. The successful entrepreneur, the confident socialite, the woman who belonged in designer dresses and exclusive rooms. None of those versions were real, but they all led me to the most honest connection I've ever known. Looking back, I realized that we're all pretending in some way. Some of us pretend to be wealthier than we are. Others pretend that wealth makes them happy when it doesn't. Some of us pretend we don't care about money when we do. Others pretend that money is all that matters when they know it isn't. The key isn't to stop pretending altogether. That might be impossible. The key is to find people who make you feel safe enough to drop the pretense little by little until you're standing before them as your complete, imperfect self. Remember, the person who will truly love you isn't looking for your perfect facade. They're waiting to meet the real you. Don't be afraid to let them see it. Sometimes the most beautiful connections begin when we stop trying to impress each other and simply allow ourselves to be known. I pretended to be wealthy for one night and found something far more valuable. The freedom that comes from being loved for exactly who I am. So maybe try it. Not the pretending part, the being real part. It's terrifying and vulnerable and absolutely worth it. Because beyond all our carefully constructed personas lies the possibility of genuine connection. And that, I've discovered, is the greatest wealth of all.